Mother is convinced she's found missing son, but people notice something's off. Roger Tichborne was young, educated, and rich, so it was not surprising when he decided to become a world traveler in 1854. 4 days after Roger's departure, however, a man walking along the coast came across the wreckage of Roger's ship, the Bella. It didn't take a genius to figure out that Roger never made it around the world, so when he seemingly returned from the dead, years later, people couldn't help but be suspicious. Roger is dead. It's desperation that made Lady Tichborne first place an ad in the newspaper. With the Bella scattered across the Brazilian shoreline with no survivors in sight, the Tichbornes steeled themselves for an unpleasant reality. With Roger dead, who would take care of the family? The psychic's message. Panicking for her family's future, Lady Tichborne sought out a clairvoyant. Whatever Lady Tichborne was hoping to get out of the psychic reading, we highly doubt she expected to hear what the clairvoyant had to say. Your eldest son, she told a mystified Lady Tichborne, is alive and well. Keeping hope alive, the psychic's message came at a time when the public was eager for news about the Bella wreck. Rumors were already swirling that some of the crew had been rescued by a passing ship. Now that the psychic claimed it was so, people couldn't help but keep hope alive, especially Lady Tichborne. Lady Tichborne's advertisement. Refusing to grieve any longer, Lady Tichborne immediately sprung into action. She took to the papers advertising a handsome reward to anyone who knew anything about where Roger could be. And when it came to possibly seeing her son alive, she didn't hold back in the ad. A most liberal reward. She not only described in detail who Roger was and what he looked like, but also how he was the heir to his deceased father's vast estate. She mentioned how people could study the ship's roster themselves and reiterate how a most liberal reward would be given to anyone with information. Despite causing a stir, it would be a decade before she uncovered any promising leads. Meanwhile, in Wagga Wagga, 10 years later, a man from Wagga Wagga, Australia, found himself in a bind. He was a butcher named Thomas Castro, and his debts were crushing him. Pressed for cash and for time, the desperate butcher made a shocking claim. He was the survivor of the shipwreck. A fateful connection. Castro also claimed that he owned several properties in England. Still, it wasn't until he held up his pipe, which was engraved with the initials RCT, that his lawyer made the connection between his client and the long-lost son of Lady Tichborne. Everything changed. Castro's lawyer pleaded with his client to come clean about being Roger Tichborne, but the butcher wouldn't budge. It was almost as if he didn't remember the shipwreck or his past life as an almost baronet at all. But when his lawyer mentioned Lady Tichborne, everything changed. Back from the dead. Almost as if someone had flicked a switch in his brain, Castro finally admitted that he was indeed the believed to be dead Roger Tichborne. When Lady Tichborne heard the news, she immediately reached out to him. It wasn't long before Castro Tichborne was en route to England. When Roger Tichborne left for Jamaica, he was tall and lean and spoke with a French accent. Now he was squat, nearly 400 pounds, and spoke with a hybrid British-Australian accent. The differences raised a few eyebrows, but not Lady Tichborne's, who was desperate to see her son in the flesh. Roger's story. And when Lady Tichborne first laid eyes on her long-lost son, she immediately knew it was him, despite the apparent changes. Since her other son Alfred had recently succumbed to alcoholism, finally finding Roger alive and well was a relief, even if his story didn't make much sense. Ready for duty, Castro Roger claimed that he'd been rescued by a ship called the Osprey and had ended up in Australia. Still, he was ready to resume life as the 11th Baronet of Tichborne, he told his mother, even though he'd spent the previous 10 years living as somebody else for no discernible reason. Roger's last will and testament. With that, Roger made arrangements to move to England permanently. He was a little strapped for cash, but his mother had no problem lending him some, and she also wasn't bothered by her son's insistence on creating a will, something he'd shown no interest in doing before. Hannah Henrietta. The will, which Roger wrote up at the urging of the same lawyer who had discovered him, was filled with odd details that some people couldn't help but question. For instance, the will contained notes about the family's properties that didn't exist, and Roger even referred to his mother as Hannah Francis, which was weird considering how Roger's mother's name was Henrietta. Providing specific details. But Lady Tichborne, a few family friends, and even the family doctor all agreed that the man standing before them was the real Roger. It helped that Castro Roger was able to provide very specific details about Roger's childhood, such as his favorite fly fishing tackle and the name of his childhood dog. So many reasons for suspicion. Still, there were details beyond his weight gain and his accent that got under people's skin. Besides not knowing his mother's first name, a reason for suspicion if we've ever heard it, Roger's letters were also filled with too many spelling and grammatical errors for such a well-educated man. A simple explanation. When forced to converse with his French family and friends, he could barely manage the simplest French phrases despite having been raised in Paris. Any memories about his boarding school days, which he'd once held dear, were all but gone. Whenever someone brought up these irregularities, however, Roger had a simple explanation: a mother's intuition. The shipwreck had been so traumatic, he explained, that his mind had never been the same. That's why he couldn't remember key details about his childhood, and that's why he treated people he'd once known like strangers. Besides, his mother believed he was who he said he was. Why would anyone question a mother's intuition? Order in the court. Well, this excuse was only viable for a few years before Roger's only real advocate, his mother, died in 1868. Now alone in the world and backed up against the wall, Roger Tichborne was forced to prove in court that he truly was the lost baronet of Tichborne. Who is this guy? As it turned out, the Roger Tichborne sitting in the courtroom trying to prove his identity wasn't as smart as the Roger Tichborne who had departed on the Bella. It didn't take long for the residents of Wagga Wagga to talk to investigators and identify Tichborne as someone else other than Roger Tichborne or even Tom Castro. Meet Arthur Orton. They referred to him as Arthur Orton, the London-born son of a butcher who'd at one point moved to Australia and taken the name Tom Castro. When he saw the posters about Lady Tichborne's search for her son, he had an epiphany. A daring plan. Orton Castro had seen the advertisements and decided that this would be a great way to raise his social standing. He'd paid, or more likely promised to pay, 2 former Tichborne servants in exchange for specific information about the real Roger's life. Even with all of this out in the open, however, Roger refused to admit defeat. Finally caught, he claimed in court that he didn't know anyone by the name of Arthur Orton. The court prepared to compile more than 200 witnesses to Orton's identity theft, but in the end, it wasn't even necessary. A quick doctor's examination proved that the real Roger had had tattoos, and that the fake Roger didn't possess any. What's the verdict? The ensuing perjury trial ended up being the longest ever in English court history, 188 court days, and there was more than enough evidence to prove that Orton had been lying from the start. The jury met for just 30 minutes before unanimously deciding that Orton was guilty. Roger till the end. He served 10 years in prison, but even prison life didn't quench Orton's thirst for notoriety. During that decade, he only admitted once that his real name was Arthur Orton, and he only did it because a journalist paid him to do so. Much needed closure. In fact, he continued to claim that he was Roger Tichborne for the rest of his life. Though he died a poor man, the Tichbornes placed a plaque on his coffin, forever identifying him as Sir Roger Charles Doughty Tichborne. For them, some semblance of closure was better than none at all, and they weren't alone in that regard.